Hola a todos, mi nombre es Valentina Rosas de Tenemos que Hablar de Chile. Muy bienvenido a todos los que nos están escuchando. Muchas gracias por sumarse a esta tarde, a este festival en el ánimo de diálogo y de colaboración que queremos compartir desde el Tenemos que Hablar de Chile FEST durante toda esta tarde. Y bueno, tengo ahora el privilegio de conversar con Adam Kahane, quien es director de Reos Partners y que se dedica, es un experto en la resolución de problemas sociales complejos y además multilaterales, con experiencia en más de 50 países y además autor de varios libros como Colaborando con el Enemigo, Power and Love, Resolviendo Problemas Difíciles y otros más. So now I'm going to switch to English to talk with Adam. Thank you, Adam, for joining us. It's a pleasure and a privilege that you join us in this festival to share your knowledge.
For me too. I'm excited by what you're doing.
Great. We too. So Adam, nowadays we are living these moments of great uncertainty and mistrust, social tension, sadly not only in Chile, but also across the world. And you have experience working on those fields. You have witnessed so many different and likely collaborations around the world, throughout Africa, Latin America. So from your experience, what role does dialogue plays in making collaboration possible, especially in these days with there is no trust and where sometimes we see each other even as enemies?
Yeah. Well, the situation is challenging. I guess now in Chile, although I don't know the Chilean situation well, but in many places, everybody imagines that it's more complicated or more difficult for them. But yeah, it's difficult in different ways for people all over the world. Well, what's the role of dialogue? For me, there's the way I think about it is really there's two basic choices. Either we use force or we use dialogue. So the reason I'm interested in dialogue and the reason I've worked for so long in different kinds of dialogue, including in situations of high complexity and low trust, is because I'm trying to promote or support the dialogue option instead of the imposing option or the forcing option, the authoritarian option. I think for a lot of people, not just in countries, but in organizations or communities or families, the default is the forcing option, to make it the way I want it to be. But I'm interested in how can people figure out together through dialogue what it is that needs to happen.
Great. And I think most of the people that is watching us today, they are quite optimistic about the value of collaboration and dialogue. But why are we missing? Why is this still so hard for many of us?
Well, I think it's hard for many of us, and it's particularly hard for people who are used to having things the way they want them to be. So, yeah, people who have had power, elites, people of privilege, people who are used to being listened to, find it frustrating when other people don't agree with them and aren't willing to go along. In a way, I think, in a certain way, I think it's a good sign that people aren't willing to put up with things that maybe in decades past they thought they didn't have a choice. But when there are different actors who have different experiences and perspectives and interests, naturally there'll be differences. That's inevitable. It will happen 100% of the time. And so the challenge is, how do we talk? How do we collaborate? How do we act together with permanent difference? So that's not easy, but that's, I think, what's necessary.
And Adam, in this idea that we have different opinions, I tend to believe that these days we are seeing each other not as just different, that also that the other one is wrong about it, about what I believe is right. And even beyond that, like it's not only wrong, it's evil.
Yeah.
So are we turning too many people into our enemies? It is social media, it is something because we are humans, or what other factor is affecting us in seeing each other in that way?
Yeah, I think that's a real issue, that it's not just that we see things differently, it's that you're wrong, and not just that you're wrong, but that you're evil. And then it becomes, how could I work with you? Because how could I collaborate with the devil? So for me, it's not just a question of difference or polarization, but demonization. And I think this tendency to treat the other as the enemy is a real impediment. I'm not saying that we never have enemies. I wouldn't go that far, but I think we don't have enemies as easily as we think we do, or as often as we think we do. So for me, the question is, how is it possible to work with people who are different, maybe even that have permanent differences, and find a way to work together, to live together, notwithstanding or in spite of our differences, not just differences of opinion, but differences in worldview, in cosmovision, in interests. These aren't necessarily simple or easy things, but that's what I think is required.
Definitely, we still need to live together, especially when we belong to the same country, to the same political community. And you have, as I said at the beginning, being part of negotiations and kind of different conflicts from South Africa with Mandela to President Santos. I believe that he acknowledged your contribution to the peace process in Colombia. What can you tell us about those different experiences? What have you learned across these conflicts that are different in nature and in different cultures, also in different nations, in different continents? What have you seen across?
Yeah, well, I'm not a negotiator or a mediator. I'm a facilitator. So my job is not to tell people what they ought to do, but to help them figure it out for themselves. Of course, every situation is completely different, and every situation is also exactly the same. It's like the fashion show in Paris. Every year it's different, and every year it's the same. So I'm particularly interested in the things that are the same. But yes, the first two experiences I had were in South Africa and Colombia, and those marked or influenced my perspective a lot. Although I worked also in my home country of Canada and in Europe and Asia and other places. I worked in South Africa in 1991, which was still in the period of apartheid. You probably know that the word apartheid, it's an Afrikaans word, it just means apartness. I mean, that's literally what the word means. And it was this, if I simplify a little bit, was this ideology and way of governance of saying we can't live together. It's not possible, in that case, for different ethnic and racial groups to live together, and therefore we're going to formally separate. That's what apartheid was, a system of formal separation. And so the end of apartheid was working out how to live together, convivencia. I think in this case, the Spanish word is better than the English word. And that's not necessarily easy or smooth. Anybody who knows about the history of South Africa in the last 30 years, it's not it's not a fairy tale where everything suddenly worked out well. There's lots of problems. But that transition from living apart to living together, more or less, was successful. And so that was my big learning from that. And it really surprised me, shocked me actually, that people who had been literally trying to exterminate each other, were able to meet together and talk together and figure out a way forward. The comment that was made about the process in South Africa by one of the participants, a man who became a cabinet minister in the Mandela government, a member of the South African Communist Party, he described that process, the Monfleur process, as we found the way forward for those of us who wanted to find a way forward. And that's what happened in 1994. The Colombian experience, in a way, was more dramatic because this was in the period of the hottest period of the armed conflict, 96, 97, where the participants in that process, Destino Colombia, included all of the armed actors, not just government and military and church and NGO and business people, but also the FARC and the ELN and the autodefensa. So this was a very amazing encounter. Actually, I was remembering that the FARC and the ELN participants in that process had been offered the safe passage to come to the talleres, which were held outside Medellin, but they didn't trust that it would be safe. And so they participated in 9 full days of workshops by telephone. So I realized we have a precedent for these virtual workshops. It worked then. If people want to work together, they can do it, no matter what the obstacles. But what I learned from Destino Colombia is the following. Juan Manuel Santos was involved a little bit in organizing this process, and then 20 years later, exactly 20 years later, when he was now president of Colombia, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he mentioned this process, Destino Colombia, in the remarks he made when he was given the prize. So I was very pleased about this, but I was surprised, and I saw him a few months later in Bogota, and I asked him why did he remember these 9 days of workshops that had happened 20 years before? And he gave for me what was a very good answer, a very profound answer. He said the reason he always remembers Destino Colombia, the reason he referred to it often, and the reason he considered it an inspiration for his work, is that that's where he learned that, contrary to all of his familial and cultural and political upbringing, comes from a political family, it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. And this, for me, was a very important way of characterizing things, because we imagine that we'll meet these others and we'll find, we have a cup of coffee and a drink and a chat, and we'll find, actually, we agree, we want the same thing. And maybe that happens, but I think Santos was posing a more usual scenario, which is we'll meet, we'll find we agree about some things, we disagree vehemently about other things, but we need to find a way to move forward anyway. And the example Santos gave of that is him and Chavez. It was obvious when Santos and Chavez met that they were never going to agree. They came from fundamentally different positions and ideologies, but they had to find a way, in that case, to live side by side as presidents of neighboring countries. So the big thing I've learned, this is the main thing I want to, with this long explanation, the main thing I've learned is simply that it is possible. It is possible to meet and talk and find a way forward together, even with people that you don't agree with or like or trust. And that's, for me, that's good news, because that's the situation that's being faced not only in Chile, but many places in the world, in South Africa, in Myanmar, in the United States, just to refer to 3 phone calls I've had already this morning. So everybody's dealing with this, and everybody's trying to find a way forward.
Yeah, it is. And well, in Chile, we are dealing with similar challenges. We have a huge process of unrest, social unrest, and also we are a few days more voting for if we want to change the constitution or no. And that is in some ways making us or dividing us in 2 different sides, sometimes very extreme different positions, and making us opponents in very different ways. So what lessons can we learn from these processes to Chile? And if we can all agree, not just political leaders, what is the role for the rest of the citizens?
Yeah. So I know these situations are difficult, and it's difficult to be in the middle of them. So I'm not gonna tell you it's all okay, it'll all be fine. But the tension and the conflict in Chile is being experienced in different ways by lots of people. So you're not alone, and others have gone before you who you can learn from, and other people can learn from you as well. So that's what I see. Yeah, I think politicians have an important role, and I wouldn't like these multi-actor dialogue to be misunderstood as an anti-democratic action. So Chileans and others fought for a long time for democracy, and so these processes mustn't replace democratic and political processes. But I also think that it's not only the job of politicians to find a way forward. I think this is a job for society as a whole, and so all of the processes that I've been involved in have involved not only political actors, but also business and civil society and indigenous and young people, and academics, trying to find a way forward together. And I think that there are a lot of ways to do this. Not only, mass activities on the one hand, or elite activities on the other hand. I think there's a middle space for groups that are representative of the society as a whole, not representatives, formal representatives. That's important in the constitutional process, but in the kinds of dialogue processes that I've been involved in, to have people who are representative of society as a whole, not just chatting, not just giving speeches to each other, not just giving their positions, but really trying to think through in quite a structured way what is possible in this situation. That's the role of scenarios. What could happen here, rather than just this is what must happen, that this is what I insist on, but to really talk about what is possible in this situation, what would make a difference between a good future and a bad future, and what can we do to enact a good future. And here, not just what do we recommend that other people do, but what can we ourselves do to enact a better future. And so I think that, well, there's a role for many activities, mass activities, popular activities, intellectual activities, political activities, but I'm talking about a particular kind of activity. That's the kind of work that I've been involved in the last 30 years, starting in South Africa. How can we, in a structured way, think through what is possible, where is the leverage to make a difference, and on how can we work together across our formations, across our communities, across our organizations and constituencies to enact a better future.
That's great, Adam. And based on your approach, where do you start? You make these different parts agree on the disagreement, on the solving of the problem, on where do you start these conversations normally?
Well, the way we start relates to what's the situation. And for me, the crucial thing about situations such as you're living in Chile is it's too simplistic to say that they're problems that have solutions. I think it's more accurate to say they're problematic situations that different actors see as problematic from different perspectives and for different reasons. So the starting point is not that we all have to agree on what the solution is, or even that we all have to agree on what the problem is. but to find people who think the situation is problematic, that things are not as they need to be. We don't have to agree on why or in what respect, but we agree that they could be better, that they could be better, that they need to be better, and that we're willing to work to make them better. And to find a group of people, a representative group of people who agree that the situation is problematic. And then the way we've started, and this turns out to be surprisingly fruitful, is to really map out what is possible in this situation. This was my big learning in South Africa in 1991, that people were so used to coming to meetings to advocate for the way they think things should be, their platform or their position or their vision or their proposal or their manifesto. There's nothing wrong with that, but you get out of that a debate or a dialogue of the deaf or a series of monologues. And that dialogue doesn't mean two monologues. It means a flow of meaning, diálogos, to create meaning together. And what we discovered in the South African experience is this activity of talking about what is possible, what scenarios are possible here, not what we want, but what could happen. And what would that look like? And what would it mean? And what would it take to get to scenario A or scenario B or scenario C? And then out of that, okay, then what is it that we can do with our communities and organizations and sectors? So it's an odd combination. It's both a highly creative process and at the same time a highly structured process, structured minute by minute. It's not just, well, why don't we come to a meeting and have a chat? And it's not, why don't we come to a conference and hear a bunch of people giving lectures at us, as I'm doing now. But how can we find a way forward together? That's what I think's crucial. And it's possible. It can be done. I've seen it with my own eyes.
That's awesome, Adam. Thank you. And what stand out to me about your work is one of your books that you put together concepts that are really unlikely to go together, at least for me, like power and love. So if you can explain us a little bit more about that approach.
Yeah, I wrote a book called Poder y Amor, and I'm finishing right now another book which I think might be more interesting to you. It's about power, love, and justice, because I think, in fact, power and love are crucial, but not sufficient. The book of Power and Love was inspired by a single sentence in a speech of Martin Luther King Jr., one of his final speeches before he was assassinated. He said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. The clash between immoral power and powerless morality is the central crisis of our time." So I really became interested in this, and I realized that the processes I was involved in can only be effective if they employ both power and love. And these words are so frequently used, sometimes it's confusing to talk about them. But what I mean by power is close to the Spanish poder, the capacity to make things happen. And we confuse poder with oppression, and so we say no, we don't want power, or we must use power to defeat the enemy. But power in its simplest meaning means the capacity to get things done. So we must have power if we're going to get anything done, if we're going to change systems, if we're going to transform our social reality. But at the same time, power without love is reckless and abusive. And so love in this context, I'm not talking about romantic love, I'm talking about the drive to unite, the drive to come together. And this is crucial. And this is the reason I wrote the book, the second part of King's statement, love without power is sentimental and anemic, that just to get together and connect is not enough. And it's not true that all you need is love. So this is how I became interested about how can you combine in this work power and love, and I think justice. Justice is what gives directionality. We're not just trying to find a static accommodation where everybody can do their thing and we can be connected. No, we need to change things. We need to make structural changes, systemic changes. And justice is this idea of a direction for what you're trying to do, making things better. And so anyhow, these are words, these are abstract words, but I think that all three are required. That a process has to include power, love, and justice if it's going to have an impact, and if it's going to be a democratic process rather than an authoritarian process, and I guess a collective process rather than an apartheid process.
Very wise words. Alama, we are running out of time, sadly, but I will ask you a final question. What advice will you give to anyone trying to engage in this collaboration process, but especially for those that are on the extremes, not us that we are trying to facilitate, when you came from one side and you maybe want to try to understand the other one, but you already see that it's too different or it's too complicated to agree. What advice or inspiring words you have for them?
Yeah, well, I guess two things. First of all, I would always be careful when you find yourself positioning yourself as contrary to the other, even as you just did in the way you posed the question. It's us in the middle and then those difficult people on the extremes. So I guess the first piece of advice would be prepared to be challenged, and be prepared to stretch, and be prepared to be uncomfortable. I had a South African colleague who said to me, when you're pounding the table, saying the truth is, then just put at the beginning of the sentence, in my opinion, and if that doesn't work, try the sentence, in my humble opinion. So these processes require, they're uncomfortable, and if you're not willing to be stretched or to change, then you're insisting on a solution where you're going to force other people to do what you want them to do. So, so remember that it's just your opinion, and those others, maybe they're your enemies or maybe they're not. And so, a spirit of humility and openness. And the second thing is that I'd say is it is possible. It's not easy, it's not predictable, it's not programmable, but it can be done. It's been done in periods of Chilean history. It's been done by other people in difficult circumstances all over the world. It doesn't necessarily lead to heaven on earth, but it is possible to live together, and it's worth trying.
It is possible. That's great. Thank you very much for your time and your knowledge, for sharing this day with us. And I hope we keep in touch to talk more about Chile.
Ok, con mucho gusto. Gracias.
Gracias. Y eso, invito a todos los que siguen conectados en esta tarde. Tenemos que hablar de Chile FEST, a seguir con la programación, con las conversaciones y el resto de los speakers y artistas que tenemos en la tarde.